The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com.
Skip it station, the cigarette party, by the Edison Quartet. Hello there, there comes the sleigh. Woo-hoo, da Bonaparte. You read nothing before any bat, you can hang your fat hip there, on him. Say, Mabel, where is that lunch basket?
Why, I think I'm sitting on it.
Oh, you think you're sitting on it, do you? Why, you know you're sitting on it.
Here, Maggie Murphy, you put that lunch basket out of the stick, will you?
Now, Trevor, I want you to stop at the very first roadhouse you come to, understand? All right, Booth. Easy. Dashing through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh, for the fields we go, laughing on the way.
Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. It's December, and we're talking about a well-known holiday classic, Jingle Bells. But the story behind this song isn't quite what you might expect. Our guest today is Dr. Kyna Hamill. She's a senior lecturer at Boston University and the editor of They Fight, Classical to Contemporary Stage Fight Scenes. Kyna, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Michael.
How did you get into the history of the song Jingle Bells, and what has the research process been like?
Yeah, I've worn a couple of hats while doing research on this. It really started by me being a volunteer at our local historical society. I live in Medford. So every Sunday I'm a reference researcher, and I help people who have questions about anything to do with Medford history. Every Christmas, every December, we very often got a phone call from a media outlet who were interested in the story of Jingle Bells. So if you go to High Street on Medford, there's a plaque that makes the claim that Jingle Bells was written there in 1850. But the thing is that Savannah, Georgia, has a very similar plaque that makes the same claim. So it sort of became a media story. People were really interested in this division. Where was it written? Where was it written? And every Christmas, and I can go back to about 1984 in the records, this story gets rehashed almost yearly, to the point that the mayors of Medford and Savannah were writing some pretty angry letters to each other, and we have all of those in the vertical files of the Historical Society. So I have done a couple of media interviews about it. I am now apologetic to some of the information I gave because it was based on what was in the vertical file. And, you know, I'm a theater historian. I went to Tufts through the Tufts PhD program. The 19th century was not really my field, so I started to get back to some of my roots from classes I took at Tufts. My area is really the 17th century. And I started to look at asking a different question. Not where was it written, but where might have it first been performed. And that was a much more fruitful question, and that is what led me to some new discoveries about the song.
Let's talk about the song itself. You, in some earlier articles, it's been characterized as a Thanksgiving drinking song about drag racing, which is not exactly how we tend to think of Jingle Bells. Is that true? What's the story behind the actual content of this holiday classic?
Okay, so in the vertical file, we have a lot of articles from past stories that have been done, the claim that it was Medford, the claim that it was based on sleigh riding songs and, sleigh riding races that were done in Medford along Salem Street. Anybody who's local would know where that might have been. And I went through the news clippings and just tried to correlate all the different points that seemed realistic. And that's usually the way that I answered the question. And I'm realizing the error in that because a lot of them were media stories. It was all seasonal. And what I most realized was the sentimentality that's associated with the song, both for Medford and Savannah. And so the Thanksgiving drunken sleigh ride songs was an article that somebody wrote. A couple other people picked up on it. It's very possible, that it became that, but that's not how it was first performed. And I think that part of the interesting thing about the historiography of the song is how it's been recycled as a seasonal story, and it's really kind of biased the historiography of the song by becoming a sentimental, kind of romanticized story in local history. And both Savannah and Medford have done that, and now I'm learning it's even possible that Troy, New York has done that, because the writer also lived there as well. So,
can we talk about the writer, James Lord Pierpont? Bit of a character.
Yeah, James Lord Pierpont was born in Boston in 1822. He was the fifth of 6 children. He was the 5th son of Reverend John Pierpont Sr. John Pierpont Sr. is himself a really interesting figure. He's actually the grandfather of J.P. Morgan, as in the banking magnate, and therefore that places James Lord Pierpont as the uncle of J.P. Morgan. So I'll just step aside and say that a lot of the papers that I looked at were at the Morgan Museum in New York, and that was really helpful. A lot of letters between James and his father, a lot of letters between James and his brother, and other people as well. So he is an interesting figure. He was born in Boston. He did live in Medford. He did live in Troy. He did live in Savannah, and he went back and forth between them. But can also be found in Florida. He sort of lived out the rest of his life in Florida, and he can be found in San Francisco during the gold rush, and during some of the San Francisco fires. So he's just, to me, a really fascinating figure who represents a 19th century man who grew up in the North in the United States, eventually ends up down in Savannah, married to the daughter of the mayor of Savannah, and ends up fighting for the Confederate cause, and ends up pretty much fighting, on the other side of where his father was in terms of the war. In the meantime, he's always looking for work. I've got him down with quite a few different professions. Sometimes he'd last 2 weeks at a job and he'd have to start something else. And as a composer, you can trace about 12 songs that's written by him, all of them minstrel music, at minstrel halls in New York, but especially at this particular minstrel hall in Boston called Ordway Hall, which operated from about 1850 to 1858 on Washington Street.
Yes, and this is one of the sort of interesting things that pops up early on in your research, it seems, this debate over where and when Pierpont wrote the song. And as you mentioned, it eventually led you to studying minstrel shows in the 1850s. What was the original theory about when and where this was written? And then perhaps, having answered that, what did you find out about where it was actually first performed?
So the question of where it was first performed brings us to a particular tavern in Medford. And he apparently found a piano and wrote out a merry little ditty, and it sounded very happy, and that's where it was written. Savannah makes a claim that it was probably written during his time as a organist for the church that his brother was minister of down in Savannah. These sort of are a dead-end question. These are dead-end parts, right? They don't really go anywhere. It's either Savannah or it's Medford, but it can't be both. So as I said, I asked a different question. I asked, where was it first performed? And it really was not that hard. I looked at the sheet music, which was published. The first time it was published was 1857. It's published as One Horse Open Sleigh. And the sheet music is dedicated to a man named John Ordway. John Ordway ran this minstrel music hall on Boston and Washington Street in the old Province House. There's a plaque there as well, very close to the CVS there. You can go down and see the plaque. And this minstrel hall actually premiered a number of James's songs beginning in 1852. He's well known to have written a number of minstrel songs, but for some reason, the Jingle Bells song, it was recopyrighted in 1859 as Jingle Bells or the One Horse Open Sleigh, has really slipped through the cracks of it being part of the minstrel tradition. And I think it's part of this romanticized history of the song. So, for example, in 1946, there's an article that comes out in the Boston Globe. And the Boston Globe archives have this. And it's really the first time that somebody makes the claim that James Pierpont wrote the song and James Pierpont came from Medford. The thing is that he's associated with writing in the Stephen Foster tradition. Well, that's a really nice way of saying that he's writing blackface minstrel songs. But even though he writes all these other songs, Jingle Bells does not get put in the category of being a minstrel song. So it seemed really obvious that this song might have been in that tradition. And it didn't take long before the fantastic Harvard Theater Collection, which has digitized all of their minstrel music and minstrel playbill collection. I went there and I went online, and in 1857, 2 days before the song was copyrighted, there it is, One Horse Open Sleigh being performed September 14th or 15th, 1857, and along with another song, The White Cottage, that he also wrote. So that night, 2 of his songs were being performed. Now that's the earliest I've found it being performed. I don't see it in any other sources. I have never been able to find it in any other hall, any other place. But I think because Ordway supported James's songwriting career, as I said, he started doing music there in 1852. It's very natural that that might have been the very first performance of the song. And it continued to be performed throughout the season. And then eventually you can find it showing up in New York, in Philadelphia, and then it eventually makes its way to song anthologies. So that's the first performance of Jingle Bells.
I wonder if you could maybe explain a little bit more about how the song works in the context of a minstrel show. Like you said, this, is originally seen as being in the vein of Stephen Foster, more closely associated with minstrel shows, but I think for many of us it might be a little surprising to hear that a performance style that we have some pretty negative associations with, understandably, would feature a song like Jingle Bells.
Yes. So the song, I think there's all these reasons why the song has slipped through the cracks of being of its historiography in the minstrel catalog. It doesn't have what Eric Lott's great book Love and Theft talks about, this dialect, and that it doesn't have a lot of words that imply a racialized dialect. So, but it was listed on the playbill as being under the Dandy Darkies section of that evening's performance. So it may not have this racialized dialect, but there's a lot of lines that have a legacy that are associated with this legacy of minstrel. So for example, the performer that did it, his name was Johnny Pell, originally from New York and made his way to Boston in 1854. He was known for singing a song called The Laughing Darky. Again, another very stereotyped, racialized way of depicting blacks that white men in blackface would do, The Laughing Darky. So let's just say that in a line like, dashing through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh, over the fields we go, laughing all the way, ha ha ha. So imagine that you have a character like Johnny Pell, known for singing a song called The Laughing Darky, is reading a line like that. So for an audience who went regularly to the minstrel theater, to see him perform a line like that would have perhaps just made reference to his own catalog of songs. There's a number of situations like that throughout the song. I think there's a line, a day or two ago, this is verse 3. We don't sing these verses very much. A day or two ago, the story I must tell, I went out on the snow and on my back I fell. A gent was riding by in a one-horse open sleigh. He laughed as there I sprawling lie, but quickly drove away. So again, imagine a white man in blackface performing a racialized dandy and singing a song about somebody coming up to them and then not helping them in the snow. I mean, I might be reading a little bit into this, but I don't think so. I think this is where you have to put on, the theater history hat and think about the way that it would have been performed, the person who performed it, and the catalog of music that person regularly sang in that same music hall.
And another aspect of this that you've pointed out in a couple of the interviews that you've given is the fact that the song is a pretty commercial proposition. It sure bears some similarities to other contemporary songs, and obviously it's something written for performance. It's something that earns Pierpont some money.
Yes. So as I mentioned, Pierpont is always out of work. He's pretty creative in the way that he comes up with work. His letters speak of him doing all kinds of things, from making dresses to running a daguerreotype shop in San Francisco to working at a dairy. I mean, it goes on and on and on, all the different things that he did. But I think that making songs with Ordway at Ordway Hall, there were a couple of songs that were already in the catalog before 1857. A song called The Merry Sleigh Ride, which was sometimes written as the Darky Sleigh Ride Party. Again, a racialized dialect. So, and this has a jingle chorus, which goes something like, "Jingle, jingle, clear the way, 'tis the merry, merry sleigh. Listen to my song as we sleigh along." So a lot of these sleighing songs are axiomatically singing about sleighing, singing about sleighing, and perhaps inviting people to sing along. Now, I'm not entirely sure about that, because Ordway Hall was quite a conservative performance hall. He actually lists in the playbills, "Don't stamp your feet." So I'm not entirely sure whether people were singing along, but the performer was singing about sleigh songs. And a number of the sleigh songs were like that. There was one called the Buckley's Sleighing Song, which also has a jingle chorus. I mean, there's a number of them that you could find. And so in 1857, when Jingle Bells, or when One Horse Open Sleigh, Jingle Bells comes out, it features the same narrative. You've got, let's go out and sleigh, let's sing about doing it, let's get some pretty girls, there might be an upset, and then there's a jingle chorus that goes along with it. So he's capitalizing on what I say is, sleigh songs were having a moment in the middle of the 19th century, especially in the northern cities of Boston, New York, and you can find it in Philadelphia as well. All of them in minstrel halls.
So how do we arrive at the version of Jingle Bells that we know today? Or perhaps, how do we put it into the context that we now associate it with today?
Well, it shows up in a number of college parlor anthologies. And these are anthologies that borrow from parlor music, but also the minstrel tradition. Just songs that have a good tune that, glee clubs and all kinds of different people interested in piano music and parlor music would put together. So it can be found in the 1880s in these kinds of anthologies. Until recently, I couldn't really find what happened to the song between the middle of the 19th century and these parlor anthologies. I've actually recently been given a collection of playbills from some boys' choirs, some Catholic boys' choirs that were performing all over Boston in the 1860s, and they're singing One Horse Open Sleigh. So it's certainly being performed pretty regularly. I don't think these boys would have been doing it in blackface, so therefore it's a popular enough song that it's being performed in various different amateur and professional contexts. But by the time it makes it to the anthologies in the 1880s, and especially at the turn of the century, when you have the Edison Quartet performing it and recording it for the first time, it's really starting to move slowly away from the minstrel tradition, as many of the songs did, and slowly make its way into a much more kind of tradition around the holidays. And by the time we get to the 1920s, it's pretty rooted in, and you can see this in visual culture as well, it's rooted in it's rooted in the tradition of the Currier and Ives images of the happy sleighing couples that are, sleighing through the snow and in a very romanticized way. So I have a lot more research to do to really figure out at what point does it become the Christmas song that it does. I think that's really mid 20th century. But there's a really interesting, it's interesting to trace the path of how this music gets parodied and transformed into this minstrel tradition, into a Christmas tradition.
And I should note that you've got a peer-reviewed article coming out in Theater Survey in 2017. So in terms of a sort of scholarly conclusion, you do have one of those coming up within the next few months, yes?
I do, and what I try to do in the article is give a context to the slaying as an activity. Slaying is an activity that therefore becomes slaying as a topic in music, as a topic in stories, and in poetry. And then looking at how the visual culture follows this tradition of slaying, and in particularly visual culture that follows slaves who come from the South and come into the North and place them in the context of winter sports and winter activities and start to burlesque basically black bodies in the snow, which in some ways I think is a part of the tradition of comes from the tradition of the minstrel shows. It's a complicated history, and I had to cut a lot from the article. It was way too long. There's still so much to be said, and I think it's just so important to put it into context, to put the minstrel tradition into context, to put it in context not just as a theatrical tradition, but for example in Boston specifically, where Ordway Hall, how Ordway Hall was situated as a middle-class entertainment for factory workers and immigrants, and how blacks were actually allowed to go to these performances until 1858, when all of a sudden they weren't. There's just so much to say and put into context around the song that I think has been really interesting.
Well, we'll post some additional links in the show notes to material from the Harvard Theater Collection related to minstrel shows, some other material about Kyna's research on Jingle Bells, and a link to that recording that she mentioned, Sleigh Ride Party, the first known recording of what we've now come to know as Jingle Bells. Kyna, thank you so much.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for taking the time.
Jingle bells, jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fun it is to ride to a horse open sleigh.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.
Good night.
Good night, Johnny. I've had a lovely time.
Oh, I'm so glad of that, my darling. Come on, break away. Get up.